Erin Aldred, welcome to the Soccer Queens podcast.
Erica, thanks for having me. Glad to join you today.
I am really looking forward to this. So it's kind of interesting with guests I have who are from Australia. This is like almost bedtime for me. So I try to get to bed by 8:30 p.m. here, but we still got like an hour or two. So I think we'll be good. But it's always interesting getting the time zones lined up. But I'm just really grateful that you're here because you have done work with soccer players in the past for many
Mm.
years, and you also work mainly with lacrosse athletes. And I just love talking with performance coaches who work with a multitude of sports because I think we can learn so much from each other, especially because of the crossover between lacrosse and soccer. And specifically, I'm intrigued by rotational power and how to build that in soccer players. So I couldn't have thought of someone better to come on to go into detail and maybe go down some rabbit holes. But before we get into that, just give a background on your athletic career and who you work with today.
Cool. Very, very kind words there. I appreciate that. So I have a bit of an interesting kind of backstory to where I ended up today in the sense of I wasn't overly active as a junior, like younger person. So I didn't start playing any sport or anything like that until I was probably 12. And I started a bit of indoor soccer, which was 30 minutes a week, very casually. But I pretty much fell in love with that straight away. Like that became my sole passion. That's what I wanted to do every day. I lived at the stadium I played at, even though I was only on one team playing 30 minutes a week. Somehow I managed to turn that to 3 nights a week, filling in for basically every possible team I could. So my love of soccer definitely started there and started to sort of grow. And then I started doing my own very unstructured, very rudimentary training that was would have been in the mid 2000s, so maybe 2006 through to sort of 2008, 9, where I'd get a soccer magazine from the local agency and like look through for drills, try to find something, practice step over, stuff like that, where I didn't really have any idea of what I was doing, but I loved training. And that's kind of then taking that to the next step of, all right, I started to play some outdoor soccer and found that quite confronting in the sense that I'd only ever played indoors, only ever played on a nice, smooth, dry surface to then going to play outdoor in the rain and the mud. And as I'm sure you can imagine, the under 15 B team doesn't normally get the best field. So you kind of put where you're going and made the most of that, had a great time, played with some friends, and then kind of almost fell out with soccer a little bit just due to some of the politics. But it was never the training, it was never the sport, it was just all of the stuff going on behind the scenes. And then at that point, I kind of decided that I want to take a bit of a break from soccer, try something different. And my brother had just picked up lacrosse. And being in Australia, lacrosse is a very niche kind of minority sport. Like I would say within Victoria, which would be the biggest state for lacrosse in Australia, we would have, I think, maybe 25 clubs total. So not a whole lot of participation there, but a very hardcore, dedicated community that love the sport. And I think that shines through on, say, the national stage, where we normally come either sort of third or fourth and very much overperform for our playing population. Started playing that, and that would have been about 10 years ago now. And just like my love for soccer blossomed early, kind of fell in love with this again because it had none of that politics, no money in the sport, purely just enjoyment of participation. So all of those positive elements without any of the negative that I saw. And then at around that same time, got involved with the gym, trying to bulk up. I had a few injuries where I dislocated my patella a couple times, did a bit of meniscus sort of damage as well at the same time. So wanted to start helping my body heal, put it in a good, strong position to basically like try and get ahead of injuries and stuff like that, rather than let the contact of lacrosse or something like that get me injured again. So started going down the training rabbit hole of the classic starting at the gym, starting bodybuilding, not really knowing what I'm doing again, but having that thirst for knowledge and just the enjoyment and the passion for what I'm doing. And I feel that's kind of a big core message across everything I've done up to this point is that I may not have known what I was doing, but I very much enjoyed it and therefore wanted to push, learn, grow, develop, and then ultimately that comes full circle when I started coaching about 5 years ago now, 5, 6 years ago. And as most sort of trainers do, start with like a general population client base, just helping anyone that wants to get fit, strong, healthy. And then from there, sort of built in towards the athlete sector, started working with a few people I knew from lacrosse and over the past couple of years have expanded that to work with soccer players, Australian footy rules, netballers, basketballers, and pretty much everyone in between. And that's kind of where we find ourselves now, with me working with a whole range of different people, playing lacrosse, loving it, and still trying to learn, grow, and develop my methods. You're on mute.
And what age groups are you primarily working with right now and what level?
So I have quite a different range, going from like youth athletes that would be 14, 15, some lacrosse, some netball. And then I would say I've got a couple kind of later teenage, coming to say college year athletes in lacrosse, soccer, and netball again. And then a whole host of sort of Gen Pop and senior athletes. But I think one of the things that I've started doing relatively recently that is quite exciting as a new growth challenge, but also in a way that I'm able to help people, is working with the under 20 Australian lacrosse team for the women's. So basically, junior girls slash women, depending on sort of how you categorize that. But a really interesting age point, whether this extends beyond lacrosse, but where they are in their athlete development is such an interesting standpoint, because they're all on a spectrum of some that have never done anything in the weight room, never really touched a weight, never really ran sprints beyond what training might comprise of, whereas some would be on the other end where they're pushing for the senior national team and they're 18, 19. So for me as a coach, it's such an interesting challenge to try and provide them programming and training that hits both of those outliers at the same time with the same level of applicable stimulus. And it's something I've never had to do before, because most of my previous work has always been sort of one-on-one, very catered and tailored to where that athlete might be at. So bringing this in a group sense has been, yeah, I think really good for my development as a coach and really good for their development as players.
It's so interesting with you would think at that level, a lot of them would be able to do all this advanced training and kinda graduate onto the cool stuff, but it sounds like you have to start with the basics like you would like a 14 or 15-year-old. So, what are some of the things that you're starting them off with, and how do you bring in long-term athletic development into what you're doing even with the more advanced athletes?
I think one of the biggest core components of how I look at a problem like that is like the raw stimulus of what I'm trying to give them. So if I'm trying to give them, say, a single leg pattern in the gym for a squat or something like that, how can I have it be scalable enough that the person who's never really tried this before is able to do it and get something out of it and still grow and develop, while obviously the other person that's a lot more advanced is still getting challenged enough to make gains and improvements? So I've been experimenting and playing with a lot of methods that I almost implore with my Gen Pop to athlete clientele, where they might do a very similar workout, but just scaled very differently. So something like, say, a dumbbell reverse lunge or something like that, where I have it, all right, you're working up to, say, a top set of 5. It's a relatively simple exercise, form execution wise. Like if it's too heavy, it's not, say, like a deadlift where you might just try and muscle it and then have bad form. If you're going to be able to do the reverse lunge, you're going to be able to get down, you're going to be able to get up. So letting them kind of work up to a weight that's appropriate for them gives them that like autonomy to be able to self-select that kind of workout and still get the most out of it, which has worked really well. And I've gotten some quite good feedback that from, say, the head coach and a few other people, that it is hitting all of the bases and demographics within that squad group really well, which I think has been great. And then in regards to, say, a little bit more of like the plyometric sort of stuff, getting them to have a more of a movement focus rather than an output focus. So say we might be doing like a single leg sort of drop between like a plate onto the floor onto another plate and bouncing kind of back and forth on a single leg there. And I might have it cued be like, you're trying to be very quick off the floor and you can have a little bit more of a rest time on each plate, but try and speed it up. But the biggest thing here is rhythm. So if that less developed athlete can generate that fluidity and rhythm, and then they can start to push it, that's awesome. For the more developed and advanced athlete, okay, maybe we raise that plate a little. But if you keep that rhythm, you can raise the plate. If you can't, you drop it back down. So again, that's a way of scaling within the same workout for both bases without having to necessarily customize 3 different programs. And then I'm sure you'd run into the whole issue of, oh my God, like, why have you put me as an intermediate? I'm an advanced athlete. And then people might end up with hurt feelings or more drama amongst the team and things like that. Whereas If there's one program for everyone, and when you're doing it, you kind of self-select the difficulty level, like everyone benefits, everyone has a good result, you know?
Have you, like, thought more and more in your career that training is really simple? Like, I feel like even just looking on social media at other performance coaches and programs, everyone's trying to, like, reinvent the wheel, but you just talked about a reverse lunge for a few minutes there, and it's like, that's a very simple but bang for buck movement, and I don't know, I just keep thinking, "Man, training's really simple, just load, load over time, and give a new stimulus, train all muscle groups, and that's it."
It's
Like, we
pretty
don't
much
need to
nail on the head.
overcomplicate it.
100%. Like, I think you get to a point in your coaching career where not that you've seen everything, but you see people just doing too much. Like in the sense of they're trying too hard. They're trying to reinvent the wheel. They're trying to create something novel and new. Like I would argue that I consume less training content these days at, I don't know, say 10 years into my training journey, 5 years into my coaching journey, where there's a small snippet of people's content that I would consume and not take to heart, but value quite heavily, really try and like learn from what they're doing. But that's shrunk and shrunk over the years as I've been able to filter out, like, okay, like I see you're doing this thing. You might be able to justify it these ways, but in my viewpoint, this is a much better alternative that is far simpler, far easier to execute, requires far less setup. So like that's not really something that would be justified to do. So I would almost come to the point where I would say I learn more from people outside of training space that relates to training in the sense of, I think it was Miyamoto Musashi said, if you can see the way in one thing, you can see it in everything. And that kind of, I feel that translates into learning more about training from things that aren't related to training.
Mhm. It's so funny you said that what you follow has shrunk over the years, and
Mm,
it's so true. It's like even just like certain podcasts on like programming, it's like I don't like no one's like saying anything new.
yeah.
In the sense it's like we're not going to invent like these like new movements. I do think like there's a time and place for some like novelty, but as long as we're just like nailing down the basics of strength and speed development and even something like rotational power. You see people trying to get wild with all these quote unquote sports specific movements like
Yeah.
a weighted lacrosse stick or whatever. But yeah, let's get into that because I think rotational power is something that can be overly complicated at times when
Mm,
we really just need to first and foremost get athletes out of moving so linear and side to side and really get them twisting and turning even if that's with just body weight to
yeah.
start with. So I'm really curious your thoughts on building rotational power and change of direction. I've always really admired lacrosse players. Obviously, I went to Hopkins. I went to every single men's
Mm,
lacrosse game and I was always so fascinated with how hard they could just whip shots. Like
yeah.
I love watching men's lacrosse. It's just amazing to see just the power behind these shots. So let's talk about rotational power because I think a lot of soccer players could learn from lacrosse in this.
Yeah. Awesome. I think one of the biggest pieces that I build rotational power from is just the ability to move rotationally, like without necessarily providing a lot of power. Like you imagine, like you watch kids playing on a playground, they're playing, but they're loose, they're relaxed, they're free, they're mobile, they're not stiff. You compare that to say like a gym bro that's come off his third chest session of the week or something like that, and he's walking like he's a fridge. So they're kind of polar opposites in terms of the ability to just move with relaxation and fluidity and flow. So obviously, there are times when you want to stiffen up and brace, but there are times when you want to be able to relax and just move like water. So being able to control that is a big element of how I blend mobility training into rotational power. You imagine if my spine doesn't twist very well and I am a little bit limited in my rotation and I'm trying to put big force through, I'm going to get a lot of jamming of vertebrae and things like that, where I'm going to have some point in that back that doesn't want to move. And all of that summation of force hits that spot. And you're basically asking for injury at some point, whether that be a disc issue, whether that be muscles in your back or something like that. So I take it back to how well can you move? How well can you rotate? How well can you laterally flex? Once we kind of have those core components ticked off, then we start to build into a bit more of a strength view where, okay, let's start to load you through your range, get you quite like build a bit more mobility, allow you to get those deep ranges, hold them comfortably. I'm sure you've had some soccer players where you might be doing, say, like a side bend or a side plank, and they're starting to fatigue and they start cramping. Like you want to be able to get to those end ranges and tolerate that stress, tolerate that force, because when you're in a game, like whether it be soccer or lacrosse, you're going to be able to you're going to put a lot more force through that back in those positions. Like if you're, say you're dribbling in on goal and you're at full speed and you have to like try and hook that shot back around, like the amount of force going through that back as you're swinging that leg like a pendulum is going to be a lot more than you'll get with like a standard side bend in the gym. So being able to tolerate that force, get to those end ranges is kind of the first point and second point that I touch on. And then from there, once we've got good competency there, then we'll start to push for the power. So some of the ways I do that in my gym currently, I'm a little bit lacking in the sense that I don't have a great wall to throw balls at, but we make it work. Like I've got a good grass space, so I'll have them kind of throw it to me in space. So for the most part, I've got about 15-ish meters of grass. So no one's thrown it over my back fence yet, but one day I'm sure that'll come. So I am quite big on to start with, a lot of just static throws. So like I'll start with a relatively still position and really try and load through my hips and explode through my core, because again, soccer, lacrosse, all rotational sports, that power is generated from the floor up. So I'm going to have my weight shift through my hips. I'm going to snap my hips, and that snap and like sort of jolt is what sends that force up through that core. You imagine, I like the analogy of a whip. Like if I try and just like push the whip, it's not really going to go anywhere. I need to have that jolt of where I whip and snap and crack it. And then that summation of force up that whip is what gives that last little segment, that crack. And that's essentially what I'm doing. For lacrosse, that's coming up my body and at my hands and at the stick. For soccer, it's coming from that pelvis down that leg and snapping out that foot as you make contact with that ball. So being able to have the sequencing there is probably the biggest part. And then like actually building better output and training, I would argue, is almost the easier part of that equation, where you do some big throws, you do some like granny throws from the floor up as far as you can upwards, as far as you can behind, kind of like you would treat the weight room, where I'm training different vectors of movement. I'm training with different loads where I'm trying to overload. Say like for myself, if I'm doing a session this week, it might look like I might have, say, a 2 kilo, a very light med ball, and I'm doing some side throws, trying to go as fast as I can. And then I might contrast that with then grabbing a 5 or a 6 kilo, a heavier weight, and doing the same movement, but it's going to be a much stronger loaded. My tissues are going to have a lot more stress put through them as I try and ramp up that same speed, but I'm unable to get that speed because of the extra load. So you're touching both ends of the sort of speed spectrum there as well. And giving your body that variability allows you to create very wide-ranging power.
Yeah, you can't really go wrong with various med ball
Mm,
exercises for that rotational power. Now, I want to backtrack to what you said about kids playing on the playground. And I love the words that you used. They were fluid and just relaxed. Supple is another word I like to
100%.
use for that foundational athletic skill of just having good rotational power. And I don't know if you're finding this, but I more and more in recent years I've seen in the younger athletes, like we're talking like elementary, early middle school, they really struggle to be fluid in their twisting and turning. And my theory is because A, they're not getting as much free play and playground work, and B, a lot of their training has become way too linear and too structured and too predictable. So I don't know if you're finding this with the younger athletes, but I feel there's something to be said that we might need to spend longer time in that, I like to call it the play phase, to
Mm.
really build that foundation to graduate onto these great medicine ball movements for rotational power. Is that something you're finding?
100%. Like you need the core competency there of just movement skill and have enough foundation with that to then be able to progress and push beyond. But like as it's been said many times, we're in an iPad generation of kids where like I'm sure every day you'd finish school and then want to go out and play with your friends, go play soccer, just do something because if you came home you're probably a bit bored. And like I was in that exact same sort of window of like when I would have been maybe 8 or 9, I think we got a computer at home and like started getting some dial up internet. But for the most part, like that wasn't something I viewed as, oh my God, I got to get home, got to get on the computer, got to play games. Like I wanted to go out and play soccer. I wanted to go out and do something like a walk down to my friend's house or something. So even outside of that play element, just general movement, like I would walk to my friends, we'd go walk to the shops or something and then walk home. And like you imagine, okay, we've walked for an hour and a half there versus someone sitting at home. And then the next day we might play, and the next day we might play again, and then we play some soccer or something. And then all of a sudden there's an extra 8 to 10 hours a week easily of activity slash sport that someone these days might not have gotten. Or like, okay, I might go to my friend's house, but then we might just play iPad or play games or something like that. So lacking a lot of that very like developmental stage movement to get that hand-eye coordination, to get that just fluidity of coordination as well. Like a very undercooked stimulus these days. So trying to implement that with athletes in the ages of say 11 to 15, 16 that they might view as fun but occasionally boring, and then they might see their friends, oh, like so and so's already lifting weights, like why can't we do that? And it's like, yeah, okay, they might be lifting weights, but they're squeezing that lemon already so hard comparative to you, where you're going to have a lot more juice to get out of this later once you've built those layers and foundation. Whereas they might be burnt out by the time they turn 16 because their coach has had them doing bench press and back squats for the last like 3 years. It's like you have so many years of an athletic career ahead of you. Why are you trying to rush that now? Like you're going to thank yourself later by not taking all that tread off your tires. Whereas if you start grinding in the early teens, and you see it a lot in like sports where the athletes can go pro quite early. I see a lot of like say like tennis players and things like that where they're spending so many hours on court doing the same, obviously very important fundamental movements for their sport, but their bodies break down because they're pushed so hard and they do the same repetitive things over and over and over and over from such a young age. Like gymnastics is another good one where they're pushed very hard very early and then can often burn out despite being almost child prodigy level.
I think I heard Joel Smith say that any young kid, as long as they sprint in different directions as fast as possible and crawl and climb and twist and turn, they're going to be way better off than the young kid who starts too early in the weight room and goes into these advanced speed and power programs. And I think that's so true. And it kind of comes back to what we were talking about earlier about how it can be that simple. Just move like a human, play, and build the foundation.
100%. And I think like even from a different angle of the same point, like if you are in the 12 to 15 range or something like that, like the benefits you'll get from really intense strength training and the like aren't there comparative to if you were 10 years older and like fully developed. Like your bones are still growing, your muscles and ligaments and tendons are all still adapting to your frame changing size at the same time. So once like say when your growth plates when you're growing, like your growth plates are still open and they haven't fused shut yet, so your bone's ability to take load just isn't what it's going to be when you're fully developed. So trying to get the best stimulus you can at that age is going to look very different to in 6 to 8 years time when you are fully developed, fully grown, and like your bones will have a much stronger load supporting ability, so then you can push weights and get a much bigger return back, and then you make more progress, and then that cycles back to you enjoying it more, and then you get better, and then it becomes that vicious cycle of improvement and development versus coaches trying to push their methodology that works for 20 to 30-year-olds onto 10 to 20-year-olds. Like just shows a lack of finesse in my view. Like again, no shade to them necessarily because they might get some results, but like if what you're doing isn't for the benefit of the athlete and is only for results, like what does that say about you as a coach? Like the athlete comes to you trusting that you are giving them the best thing for them, whether they know that or not. Like I have some clients that love to train hard as they can, like will leave everything on the floor. And at times it's on me to pull them back and say, hey, like this isn't that session. You like say one of my junior netball athletes, she had, I think like 3 or 4 trials across 2 or 3 days, plus school, plus extra training, and then comes to me on the day after and is like, I'm spent, but I've got a trial tomorrow, so I want to train really hard. And I'm like, no, that is not what we need right now. We need you to relax. We need you to feel good, loosen up, like get your body prepped for tomorrow. Like if I push you through a hard session now, you're gonna collapse tomorrow. Like you've had a huge workload spike out of nowhere. Like we need to play damage control at this point. So coming back to exactly that, like it's on me to give the athlete what they need, even if they think it might not be what they want, you know?
The workload conversation could be an entirely separate podcast.
The deep
That's
rabbit hole.
Yeah, and honestly, it's probably one of the biggest missing pieces in injury mitigation that no
Mm.
one's talking about. But yeah, maybe we'll do a part 2 on that. But I do wanna come back to what you said about, younger kids not being able to really take advantage of that, like, moderate to heavy strength training, like, pre-puberty especially,
Mm.
especially in girls because they haven't had the hormonal, fluctuations yet to get testosterone and to build muscle, at that point. Usually that happens after age 12 and a half, some girls 13, and then they can truly get in the weight room. So I think it's important to just remind everyone of that. But when they do get to that point where they can load with heavier weights, what are some exercises that you like that really support rotational power, solely strength exercises?
I think I come at this kind of 2 different ways. Like I like, say, as we were touching on before, like dumbbell reverse lunges, like RDLs, hip thrusts, the exercises that train those big core muscles that generate a lot of that force, like bench press, like pull ups, whether that be assisted or body weight, like pull downs. A lot of those, yeah, big core muscles are one side of the element. And then I have a very big affinity for frontal plane movements. And essentially what that means is you imagine I've got a panel of glass in front of me and a panel of glass behind me. I can only move side to side. So things like side planks, side bends, any sort of like Copenhagen, adductor planks, things like that that challenge my body's ability to hold that straight shape without deviating laterally is huge in rotation. Often you'll find, whether it be probably not quite as much in soccer because you're not having too much of that torso do that exploding of rotation, but in soccer, in javelin, in discus, in cricket, anything like that where we're really projecting out the arms, you'll see a lot of deviation of people leaning in one direction too far, and generally that's a lack of frontal plane strength. So I need to be able to control my body and not have that force escape in a way that's inefficient, because I want all of it obviously summating out my hand, foot, whatever it may be. So I'm very big on side planks, side bends, Copenhagens, and not just in the traditional sense of like, oh, I'm holding a side plank, I'm here for 30 seconds, cool, tick it off. Like playing with the ability to get really far down and stretch as much as I can to tolerate that, again, longer loaded position, building resiliency and building that muscle's ability to handle that tension at a really long length. Like I know from a lot of rotational sports, backs are a high source of injury. And then adding to that the amount of force and stress you're putting it through, like it's that double-edged sword where you can be a very glass cannon sort of player, but at any moment you might have something go in that back. So trying to build that and get ahead of that curve and have that be as robust as possible, able to handle that force and also produce a very high max output, comes back to that mobility, strength, control of the muscle, and just durability in general there.
Is there anything else you want to leave the listeners with in terms of building rotational power?
I think coming at it from the point of a lot of reps in the sense of a low effort an output is a great way to build that fluidity and like just fluency in general there. So whether that be soccer, you imagine some of the best like strikers of a ball, say like Cristiano Ronaldo is a great example where he's obviously a phenomenal athlete all around, but he's very much able to leverage a lot of his body weight and force and power that he can produce into that strike through rotating his hips. But the sort of player where was obviously very talented naturally and then got in the weight room and amplified his ability there is a prime example of what you want to do. Like thousands of hundreds of thousands of reps, I'm sure, at building the competency of the skill, worked hard in the weight room, and then was able to generate the best outcome. So train for your skill like you're trying to get a PhD in it. You become so good at that movement, and then you output in the weight room, and that's going to make you better. But don't get sidetracked in thinking that the weight room is the ends to the mean. That's just the way to get there. The actual soccer ability and being able to put that on the floor, on the field, is what you're training for at the end of the day.
I love it. And I think this episode really gave the listeners a great toolbox of exercises to start with and then to eventually progress to based on age and maturity level and even training age. That's not talked about too much, but I'll leave some links in the caption below with the exercises Aaron mentioned. There are also QR codes to all those in my book, Female Athlete High Performance. So you'll be able to get the YouTube links there, the Copenhagen's med ball variations, it's all in there. And Aaron, thank you so much for coming on and bringing some lacrosse insight to the soccer world. And at the end of the day, we want to just build well-rounded athletes no matter what the sport. So this has been really awesome, and be sure to check out Aaron's social media links as well as website in the caption below. Follow up with him, follow him on Instagram. He has some amazing content that any athlete can take advantage of. So Aaron, thank you, and I'll see everyone next time.